Henry Kissinger famously quipped at one point that Israel had no foreign policy, only domestic politics. It was an exaggeration, but one could be forgiven looking at the Israeli political scene today for thinking that politics is the be-all and end-all. Four strands will define Israeli political realities in the period ahead, strung together like the weave of a finely woven Persian carpet. Number one, Benjamin Netanyahu, despite the tremendous pressures that he's under, a resurgence of COVID-19, economic recession, 1 million Israelis unemployed, and of course facing indictments on bribery, breach of trust, and fraud in a trial later this year, early next, is under tremendous pressure. But he will remain the most willful, skillful Israeli politician for some time to come. And none of us should be surprised in the next several weeks or months ahead if a fourth election is scheduled, the fourth in a little over a year, a remarkable development, in which Netanyahu will try to assemble a coalition of 61 in order to subvert a majority of the right wing in an effort to subvert the legal process against him. Number two, Israel has moved ever rightward over the course of the last 2 decades. The explanation are changing demographics, which has strengthened the Orthodox community and the religious right, a failed peace process, fraught withdrawals from Gaza and Lebanon, and traditional grievances on the part of the Likud's constituency against the labor-dominated elites which control the country for much of the early period. And since governing in Israel requires a coalition, it is the right, Likud and the religious right, and the Zionist parties, which will be in the best position to form a government. Number three, so you might say, what about the opposition? There is no opposition. The Labor Party, the founding party of the state of Israel, actually sits in the same government, a former shadow of itself with Benjamin Netanyahu. The left in Israel has been essentially undermined as a consequence of the collapse of the peace process. The Arab-Israeli political parties, riven by their own internal differences and by the unwillingness of the Jewish political elites to sit with them formally in a government, have limited influence. And Benny Gantz has proven to be, despite his avowed patriotism, quite a disappointment. In joining Netanyahu in this emergency government, he's undermined his own party and diminished his own credibility. And finally, I think the most important factor of all is that Israel confronts a leadership crisis. It's in a transition from a generation of founders, Ben-Gurion, Begin, Rabin, who had the moral authority and the skill to get most of the big decisions right, which has ensured Israeli security and prosperity, a transition to a generation of younger politicians who lack those attributes. And this crisis cannot be solved in Washington or anywhere else. What Israel needs is a centrist, pragmatic leader to govern a coalition composed of many elements on the political establishment, but elements that are willing to re-inject civility, rule of law, good governance back into Israeli society and ameliorate some of the polarization and tribalism that negatively affects the political climate. In short, if Israel had such a leader and such a coalition, Israelis could begin to make peace among themselves, which would put them in a much better position to take on the excruciatingly difficult challenges of making peace with the Palestinians.